We're turning together this evening to Mark chapter 7. And I explained as I was just reading a moment ago that we will be focusing on the second half of this chapter, in which there are two wonderful miracles, both of which have something to teach us concerning what matters in coming to God. I remind you of the context. Context is always important in understanding the Bible. And in it, the beginning of the chapter, the Pharisees found fault because of the failure of the disciples to keep the traditions of the elders. And bringing that to Jesus, they ask why that obviously isn't being insisted on, why he isn't making sure that his disciples observe that tradition. Now, the implications could be many. There is the suggestion that Jesus rejects the wisdom of the fathers that by now have been exalted to a place that they don't deserve, but that somehow it's arrogance or pride on his part, that there's this rejection of the understood traditions and wisdom that's been handed down. And tradition has completely taken over. And so Jesus addresses these areas in his teaching. The first is worship without heart, without spirit. It's just the mechanism by which the soul is enabled to approach God. And we can get so taken up with the format or the formula or the tradition that we can forget what worship is really all about. And that can be in any context or setting. That can happen in our own. There's no church, I said this morning, that thinks that's a problem. But it always can be, where people can be going through the required ritual, ceremony, or tradition and forgetting what worship's all about. So Jesus deals with worship without heart. And he then deals with truth without tradition. And he explains that they have prioritized tradition and exalted it and elevated it to such a position that they are actually using it to cancel out the clear instruction that God has given. And he illustrates that for them. And how we need to be careful over such things. And then he brings it right to where it needs to be and right to home and lands it by talking about transformation or cleansing without transformation. And they had made this approach to God ritualistic. Well, we wash our hands. Of course we're unclean. We accept that. You accept that. Of course we have impurity. So we wash our hands and we go through the right ritual and we perform meticulously and carefully the right ceremony, and then we're clean. And Jesus is explaining how you can't be cleansed inside you from something outside you. And how there needs to be a change within you, and not just some outward conforming to a ceremony or ritual or tradition. And he teaches and elaborates, and he is suggesting, he says something quite radical, that is bringing in the New Testament era, the New Covenant, where he actually describes all meats as clean. And to a Jew whose identity, even today, is very much caught up with those external things that they do and don't do, that was radical. That was shocking. Now, how does that connect to the two miracles that Mark chooses to pair together and speak to us about next? Well, the connection of thought is quite simply, well, what matters in coming to God? Tradition doesn't matter. We can see that. The externals don't matter. We can see that, even though they're necessary. But what does matter? And so we have these two miracles. There's the healing of the daughter of a Syrophoenician woman, and then there is the miracle of healing the dumb and the deaf man, or the deaf and the dumb man. And I want to look at those two miracles tonight. And the first miracle is striking. And let me pick this out before we go through it. For the bold and confident faith of this woman. Now, what we see here, and this is significant, is that Jesus is moving beyond the borders of Israel, going out into Greek territory in Tyre and Sidon, intentionally going beyond the sphere of working among the Jews. And that becomes significant later in the miracle. But he's intentionally going out and showing us, if you like, in practice, what he's just taught the people in theory. Because he has implied that there is this broadening of the work of God and this move of God, not just confined to a particular nationality primarily. You can see that throughout the Bible, God always welcomed in the stranger. There was never, the Jewish identity was a covenant. It wasn't an exclusive club. You could always come in. And I always find it wonderful to read the genealogy on page 1 of the New Testament and notice along the way where it included those strangers that God chose to bring in the genealogy of his son, Jesus. So strangers were always welcomed, but God was primarily at work among the Jewish nation. But when the Messiah comes, he will be a light to the Gentiles. And it won't be about Jew or Gentile. God will take that division that currently exists and he'll dissolve it. He'll remove it completely. And in coming to God, here's the first lesson. It doesn't matter whether you're a Jew or a Gentile. Jesus is going beyond the borders and he is seeking intentionally to do a work among a Gentile company. When the woman approaches him, we have Mark's description of her that makes it clear, verse 26, she is a Greek and a Syrophoenician. And so that compounds the idea that the work of Jesus has now come to the point where it is spreading light to all the world, not just to one nation. And so this woman comes, and what we see is not just this gospel expansion, but we see this humble approach to asking for help. She comes and she falls down at his feet. And you'll find that mentioned so many times throughout the Bible, and it is a profoundly humbling and open act of self-abasement, we might say, for someone to bow down regardless of everyone else. And it is an act of honor that we would never countenance having as a general greeting. You don't meet me on a Sunday and bow as I walk up the aisle like the king or the queen, and you all curtsy and bow. Why? Why don't you do that? That's a good question. Why don't you do that? Well, because of who I am and who you are and the relationship that we have is that relationship. But if the king walked in, depending on what you think about the royal family, of course, there's a caveat there, I suppose, you would mark that moment with such an act of respectful quietness, perhaps even curtsying, bowing. And here's a recognition by this woman then, openly and publicly, she's down, that she's begging and she is marking honorably the respect that Jesus deserves. She is recognizing his authority. And when you're coming to God, what matters is not whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, but it does matter whether you recognize the authority that Jesus has, the power of God. Do you come knowing he can help me? He can save me. And you might say, yes, but there's other things. Will he? Well, we'll come to that. But let's just pause there and ask ourselves the question, as we come to him, do we believe, humbly acknowledging, recognizing in his authority, in his majesty, in his glory, in his position and office, that he is the Saviour, that there's no other name given under heaven among men whereby we could be saved? Do we believe that he can help us? He can heal us, that he can forgive us, that he can give us eternal life, that he can make us God's child? Do we believe that? Because that's what this shows. So here we have the gospel expansion. We have a humble approach. But then, and here's this wonderfully extraordinary thing about this miracle, and I do really want you to get this in the next two thoughts. We have a very testing reply. Deeply and profoundly, Jesus uses words that will discover in this person's heart what's really there. And he says, well, when you have food, first you feed the children. And it isn't right to take that food away from the children and feed it to the dogs. And what's he saying? Well, he's saying two things. He's saying, he's in theory, if you like, demonstrating in practice that there's a pattern to how God works. And the gospel does come to the Jew first. Paul emphasized this, the Jew first, but also to the Gentile. And so he is likening get this, he's likening the children to the Jews and the dogs to the Gentiles. Now, why would he choose that as an illustration? Couldn't he, the Lord of heaven and earth, the infinitely wise one, have chosen something a little bit more palatable, a little bit less condemning or critical or judgmental, because he's choosing an illustration that says, well, I'm a dog, and I don't get to eat the children's meat. And Jesus is intentionally confronting her with who she is and asking her to make an evaluation as she comes to God. And I have to say that is where a lot of people stumble and say, well, please yourself. If you don't want to help me, then that's fine. And some people would have responded by that. Why? Because they would get offended. And what they would do is take that revelation as an insult. Let me tell you, it might come across this way because of how some people choose to teach it. But when the Bible condemns you, it is never destructive. It is never intended to destroy you. It's never intended to crush your spirit. It is intended to enlighten you as to your need, as to your position. When you come to God, it is very important for you to know who you are and know who he is. And what we find is that as she's brought to this moment of profound
challenge, if you like, and testing. She passes this test with flying colours because she has the most amazing reply. Because she says, yeah, that's true. As an illustration, that's totally true. I wouldn't take my children's food and then throw it to the dogs. I'd feed the children first and the dogs get the leftovers. But even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the table. And what she is saying is, in effect, yeah, I might be a dog, but there's enough mercy in you for me too. And I think that is the whole point of this miracle. And the wonderful way in which this transaction happens is, if you read it in Matthew's Gospel, that he points out the amazing faith that she has. And what's the faith? Is the faith that she makes a proper value judgment of her own unworthiness? No. That's not the amazing faith. That's not why she is bold and courageous and confident. She makes a right value judgment about who she is. That's just accepting what she knows in her heart to be true. As we must all do that, because we've all, in some measure, recognized our own brokenness and felt shame for our own sinfulness. And so there is in us all that recognition that needs to happen of our own condition, if you will. But here's the amazing faith. Here's where faith comes in. She recognizes that there is an abundance of grace that can still help her, that can still include her. Do you see that? How it isn't that she's got faith well enough to believe that she's a sinner. That doesn't take an awful lot of faith. Let's be honest. But what she comes to demonstrate is that she believes in the abundance of the generosity, kindness, and compassion, the grace of God. Do you believe in the grace of God? Because coming to God, that matters. Yes, it matters not whether you're Jew or Gentile. It matters definitely whether you are humble in coming to God and that you recognize and believe that God can help you. But this matters even more. Not so much that you know who you are, but that you start to have your eyes open and see who He is. And you can find in life peace and freedom, not from changing who you are, first and foremost, but from, and that's how we often seek that peace. I need to change who I am. But from seeing who He is. And that change can only really come after you do that. After you see who He is. And so she recognizes the grace. She accepts the description. Well, yeah, dogs. So what? They get to eat the crumbs. She is also showing, by likening it to crumbs, this is nothing to you, Lord. You can do this. It's nothing to you. It's like a crumb of your power. So here is a woman who comes, and then, of course, she doesn't argue. She doesn't declare her status, her worthiness. She doesn't have a sense of entitlement. She just has faith. Not that she's worthy, but that He's full of grace. Of course, we have this distant deliverance where Jesus doesn't go to her house. He doesn't need to say anything or do anything. He just says, go home. Because of what you've said, your daughter's whole. And that is the faith that saves. We could call it saving faith. Is not the faith that
sees who I am. That's an important barrier that some people stumble at because they get too prideful and offended. But the faith that sees who Jesus is. And so she goes home and the daughter's well. And there's a further instance that marks revealing of the power and position and authority of Jesus, the Son of God, that can heal just by a word. Geography is not the barrier. Being a Greek is not a barrier. And in your situation, being guilty of this, that, the other thing, that's not a barrier. The barrier so very often is within us. Now that leads us to the second miracle. And the second miracle about this healing of the man who couldn't hear and couldn't speak, the deaf and the dumb man. And in this instance, and all of the miracles have symbolic significance, but in this instance, the Bible picks up on this theme of being deaf and blind and dumb to describe spiritually what Jesus has come to heal, whereas here in the literal sense, it is physical. This man physically could sit there tonight where you're sitting and see my lips moving but hear no sound. And they might be very good at lip reading, or if that was the case, we might have someone over here moving their hands about in the right direction so that they could get it, they could take on board. But this is literal. This man cannot literally hear, and he cannot literally speak, or at least properly. He can make sounds, but they don't come out as words. And spiritually speaking, that is a deeply and profoundly symbolic theme that the Bible picks up on, to say, well, mankind becomes just that. We don't listen to God, and we can't speak properly about God. And there are lots of reasons why we get closed off, why there's this inner hardness that happens, and we stop paying attention to or aren't open to God in our lives. And we don't listen. And God speaks, but that might be something I don't want to hear. And sometimes, sadly, the cause of that can be previous trauma or painful experiences where it seems that someone has come with deeply and profoundly hurtful and condemning language, and that has traumatized us, and we have the human brain has a very instinctive defense mechanism, and we just don't listen. We don't want anything to do with that. And some hurt people stop listening to God because they're traumatized. Other times, it can be some prideful people, and they have a view that they try and find some kind of comfort in their own strength and greatness and accomplishments and achievements, and they derive that sense of identity within the rest of society or in their family from their superiority in some measurable metric. You know, the truth is that you'll always find someone that's better than you and someone that's worse than you in some area. But pride can also mean, well, why should I listen? Why should I give attention? And a sense of self-sufficiency or strength can also be that. And then fear. Fear is also, I would say, the third great reason. Pain or hurt, pride and fear. People are afraid, well, you know, I might have to change. I'm not sure. And so
They will latch on to something that someone said or that they've heard and make that their armor. Well, religion's for weak people anyway, or we all evolved and there's no creator. They know that's nonsense and it doesn't stack up, but they're afraid. So there can be lots of reasons why we are spiritually deaf. And so with that framing, we look at this miracle. And Jesus is brought this man. He doesn't come of his own volition. He is one of those, and there's many of these. We already looked at the man who was let down through the roof. But here, they bring him to Jesus for him to help this man. And so often when we are closed off, we need others to do the work and to bring us to the Lord. And there are ways and means that as Christians we can help. There's also ways we can hinder, but there's ways that we can help in the bringing of others to the Lord. And we endeavour to do that. All of us want to lead people and bring people. And that is not always about just having the right word to say at the right time, because people are closed. They bring him to the Lord. But here's the interesting thing. While there's a crowd there and he is brought to the Lord, it says here, takes him aside. He takes him to a private place. He keeps him away from the prying eyes and the people who will see what's going on. And he leads him aside to help him. And that tells us something powerful and significant. Because when God deals with us and we come to him, and in this instance are brought to him, what needs to happen, and this ties all the way back to Jesus' parable and the teaching about the heart being the important thing. It isn't about an emotional response that others can witness and see and raising a hand or doing something out of public or social or communal pressure in a church environment. It is about a deeply personal work within you. And God deals with us as individuals. He doesn't categorize. He isn't mass producing miracles here. And what he does when he heals this man is profoundly unique and individual. And that's the point. As he spits and puts his hand on his tongue and touches his ears and things like that, and you say, well, why did he do that? The point is that our God is a personal God, and when you're coming to God, what matters is you and God, nobody else. You've got to put other people away. Forget about what they think, how they'll react. There's so much pressure from outside, and what matters is you and God and your relationship with him. And are you right with him? Silence those voices that crush your spirit and hurt you. Or those voices that tell you you're strong and you don't need this. Or that voice of fear that tells you that you should be cautious and not go there. And deal with God on that deep and personal level where all those things are silenced and it's just you and the Lord, and you're dealing with him and you're seeking his healing and his mercy and his grace. It has to be on a profoundly, deeply personal level that we all meet with God. Every one of us. And many of you tonight are Christians and you've been born again. But that didn't happen by public spectacle within the public eye. You spoke of it afterwards to reveal outwardly what had happened inwardly. So here's a deeply personal and private miracle. He's brought by others. He's taken aside. And then the Lord speaks and heals him in a most tender and gentle and personal way. initially it says, the Lord sighs. Now, if I was in the middle of a sermon and you all decided to let out a huge sigh, I would have to think to myself, I wonder why they're sighing. Are they getting a little bit fed up and thinking, well, when's this going to be over? Or is there something more profound? And in Jesus' case, there is most certainly something more profound. He isn't sighing out of impatience. He's sighing as his spirit is touched out of compassion. And what matters is not whether you're fit to come to him. It's whether he is willing to help you. Is he willing? Oh, yes, he is. And we see this, and he reveals this. It's God coming to us. It's God having care and concern and sighing over us. And then he lifts up his eyes to heaven as a sign of the authority and the unity between the Father and the Son. And that perfect unity that's there. And then with creating power, he speaks the word and says, Ephrata, be opened. And all of a sudden he can hear. And all of a sudden he can speak. The chapter ends, verse 37, in this way. And the people, Jesus told them not to tell anyone, but they did. That's the messianic secret, isn't it, that I've been speaking about. And it says, they not only told people, published it, and were beyond measure astonished, saying, he hath done all things well, and having nothing to eat, he maketh both the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak. What we see there is wonder. The work of Jesus is amazing. And he takes people that are broken, sinful, and he makes them whole. And he has come to heal your broken spirit and to take away that brokenness and make you whole. Not by changing the evaluation, reframing it to make it sound a little bit less self-condemning. He doesn't come to say, you're not so bad after all, and think that will help. He comes with the abundance of grace, the mercy of God, and the power to work from the inside out, and to gradually and slowly and patiently come alongside you, not just to save you once and forever through his wonderful work on the cross, but to walk with you every day and to perfect in you what he begins until it reaches its completion in heaven. The work of Jesus is wonderful because he takes people that are under the condemnation of God's justice and righteousness, and he brings them to God. One of our hymns says he makes a rebel, a priest, and a king. And that is wonderful. But it's also perfect. And this is our final thought tonight. I want you to get this. He has done all things well. This man wasn't partly healed. And when Jesus came and stepped into someone's broken situation and circumstances, he doesn't begin and then finds he's unable to complete. It echoes the language of Genesis chapter 1 when God looked on it and said, it's all good. And it's God's pronouncement on you. It's all good. The word means he's done it excellently, perfectly. He's completed it. It's done well. And that's emphasizing not just you coming, you believing in his grace, but his work in you, inside you, his transformation. Tonight, may God give you ears to hear, and then loose your tongue to sing his praise and speak to him words of truth. Amen.